Hello, sixth grade, and welcome to lesson 2 of chapter 3. This lesson is titled The Agricultural Revolution.
Lesson 2. The Agricultural Revolution. It matters because the Agricultural Revolution allowed people to set up permanent settlements. Neolithic times. Guiding question: how did farming change people's lives? The earliest people were nomads who moved from place to hunt animals and gather plants. After the last ice age ended, Earth's temperatures rose. As the climate warmed, many nomads moved into areas with a mild climate and fertile land. Another historical revolution then occurred. For the first time, people began staying in one place to grow grains and vegetables. Gradually, farming replaced hunting and gathering as the main source of food. At the same time, people began to domesticate or tame animals for human use. Animals transported goods and provided meat, milk, and wool. The Neolithic Age. This change in the way people lived marked the beginning of the Neolithic Age. It began about 8000 BC and lasted until around 4000 BC, about 4,000 years. The word Neolithic is Greek for new stone. Calling this time period the New Stone Age, however, is somewhat misleading. Although new stone tools were made, the real change in the Neolithic Age was the shift from hunting and gathering to systematic agriculture. This is growing food on a regular basis. This shift from hunting and gathering to food production, however, did not happen quickly. Even during the Mesolithic Age, or Middle Stone Age, some people continued to hunt and gather while others began to grow their own food.
Okay, so let's go ahead and review the main parts of what we read about. Now, we're starting to talk about the agricultural revolution. Agriculture is farming. So, during this time period, nomadic people started to shift their lifestyles. They no longer moved around as much. A lot of them started to settle down and pick a space to live in. So, the places that they picked to live in were places that had kind of mild or temperate climates, right? Where the weather didn't get too hot or too cold. There were fertile lands, so there were lands that were good for growing different kinds of crops. And they shifted from being primarily hunter-gatherers to being agriculturally led, or that became the dominant way that they sourced their food. So they would begin to grow food. They would begin to domesticate animals so that they can use them for the different needs that they had. So horses, donkeys, things like that they could use as transport animals, help move things from one place to another. If they had goats and cows, they would domesticate them, keep them in a particular area, use them for milk. Sheep they would use for wool, and so on. So this shift away from a nomadic lifestyle was called the Neolithic Age, which means or stands for new stone. Now, they also, during this time period, they came up with new or different tools to fit the lifestyle that they were currently living in. So the main part of the Neolithic Age or the Neolithic era was the change to systematic agriculture. So this is when they began growing their food regularly, not just here and there. And a change like this, of course, takes a long time. Even as they moved into the Mesolithic Age or the Middle Stone Age, people were still hunting and gathering while others were growing their own food. And again, it depended on where they lived and the resources they had. Those were two of the most important driving factors for the lifestyle that people had during that time.
Big changes for humankind. Historians call this settled farming during the Neolithic Age the agricultural revolution. The word revolution refers to any change that has an enormous effect on people's ways of life. While hunter-gatherers ate wild grains that they collected, early farmers saved some of the grains to plant. Humans lived differently once they learned how to grow crops and tame animals that produced food. They now could produce a constant food supply. This allowed the population to grow at a faster rate. Nomads gave up their way of life and began living in settled communities. Some historians consider the agricultural revolution the most important event in human history. Widespread farming. By 8000 BC, people in Southwest Asia began growing wheat and barley. They also domesticated pigs, cows, goats, and sheep. From there, farming spread into southeastern Europe. By 4000 BC, farming was an established economic activity in Europe. At about the same time, around 6000 BC, people had begun growing wheat and barley in the Nile Valley in Egypt. Farming soon spread along the Nile River and into other regions in Africa. In Central Africa, different types of crops emerged. There, people grew root crops called tubers, which included yams. They also grew fruit crops such as bananas. Wheat and barley farming moved eastward into India between 8000 and 5000 BC. By 6000 BC, people in northern China were growing a food grain called millet and were domesticating dogs and pigs. By 5000 BC, farmers in Southeast Asia were growing rice. From there, rice farming spread into southern China. In the Western Hemisphere between 7000 and 5000 BC, people in Mexico and Central America were growing corn, squash, and potatoes. They also domesticated chickens and dogs. Progress check. Explaining. How did the spread of farming change the lives of nomads?
So again, let's go back and review what we read about here. So this time period when people started to shift primarily to farming is called the agricultural revolution. So a revolution is any big change that has a really large effect on people's lifestyles. Now, farming was a huge shift away from hunting and gathering. They could farm and collect grain and it would last for a while. It's not something that they needed fresh every single day. It helped them to change their lifestyle and allowed them to settle into communities as opposed to being nomadic and having to move from place to place. By 8000 BC, people in Southwest Asia also began growing wheat and barley. They started to domesticate animals, and by 4000, farming was an established economic activity in Europe. So this is things, now people are buying and selling different things that have been grown. And you can see throughout the reading how this has spread throughout the world and into different areas.
Life in the Neolithic Age. Guiding question. What was life like during the Neolithic Age? During the Neolithic Age, people settled in villages where they built permanent homes. They located villages near fields so people could plant, grow, and harvest their crops more easily. People also settled near water sources, especially rivers. Neolithic communities. Neolithic farming villages developed throughout Europe, India, Egypt, China, and Mexico. The biggest and earliest known communities have been found in Southwest Asia. One of the oldest communities was Jericho. This farming village grew in an area between present-day Israel and Jordan called the West Bank. The village of Jericho was well established by about 8000 BC. It extended across several acres. The area of sun-dried brick houses was surrounded by walls that were several feet thick. Another well-known Neolithic community was Çatalhöyük in present-day Turkey. Although little evidence of the community remains, historians know that between 6700 and 5700 BC, it covered 32 acres and was home to about 6,000 people. The people lived in simple mud brick houses that were built close together. What if instead of a front door, your house had a roof door? In Çatalhöyük, the houses did not have front doors. Instead of going through a door in the wall, people entered their homes through holes in the rooftops. They could also walk from house to house across the roofs. People decorated the inside of their homes with wall paintings. In addition to homes, Çatalhöyük had special buildings that were shrines or holy places. These shrines were decorated with images of gods and goddesses. Statues of women giving birth have also been found in the shrines. Both the shrines and the statues show that the role of religion was growing in the lives of Neolithic people. Farmers grew fruits, nuts, and different grains on land outside Çatalhöyük. People grew their own food and kept it in storerooms within their homes. They raised sheep, goats, and cattle that provided milk and meat. They ate fish and bird eggs from nearby low-lying wetlands called marshes. Scenes drawn on the walls of the city's ruins show that the people of Çatalhöyük also hunted.
All right, let's take a look at some different photos. So Çatalhöyük was an ancient village, and it's a remarkably well preserved site that was established around 6700 BC. It was home to about 6,000 people during the Neolithic era. The mud brick houses were located close to each other with no streets separating the buildings. So to enter the buildings, you can see these openings at the top. And that's how people were accessing the inside of their house. Houses had fireplaces. Platforms were used for sleeping, sitting, or working. The people here grew mainly wheat, barley, and peas. The main source of meat came from raised cattle, but inhabitants also relied on hunting. Bright murals were painted on the inside of village walls, and figurines of animals and goddesses were mounted on many walls. No one knows what happened to this ancient city, so it's really well preserved, but no one knows where the people went or what happened to them. Çatalhöyük was first excavated in 1961 by British archaeologist James Millard. Archaeologists are still working at this site today. The archaeologists have uncovered works of art and objects of religious significance. So all these different artifacts that they're finding are helping them gain a better understanding of what life was like during that period. Today, tourists can visit the site and learn how Neolithic humans lived in one of the first urban communities on Earth.
What were the benefits of a settled life? Neolithic people needed protection from the weather and wild animals. A settled life provided greater security. Steady food supplies created healthier, growing populations. As the population increased, more workers became available. Those individuals could grow more crops. Villagers produced more than they could eat, so they began to trade their food for supplies they could not produce themselves. Because an abundant amount of food was produced, fewer people were needed in the fields. Neolithic people began to take part in economic activities other than farming. Specialization occurred for the first time. People took up specific jobs as their talents allowed. Some people became artisans or skilled workers. They made weapons and jewelry that they traded with neighboring communities. People made pottery from clay to store grain and food. They made baskets from plant fibers. They also used plant fibers to weave cloth. Ötzi, the Neolithic Iceman, wore a cape made from woven grass fibers. These craftspeople, like farmers, also exchanged the goods they produced for other things they did not have. The roles of men and women changed when people moved into settlements. Men worked in the fields to farm and herd animals. They gradually became more responsible for growing food and protecting the village. Men emerged as family and community leaders. Women bore the children and stayed in the villages. They wove cloth using the wool from their sheep. They also used bone needles to make clothing from cloth and animal skins. In addition, women managed food supplies and performed other tasks. The growth of communities did not always bring benefits. In some places, such as settlements in present-day Jordan, rapid population growth caused resources such as wood supplies to be used up quickly. On occasion, this loss of forestation caused desert-like conditions to spread. Where this type of ecological damage occurred, many settlements were abandoned. The end of the Neolithic Age. During the late Neolithic Age, people made more technological advances. Toolmakers created better farming tools as the need for them arose. These included hoes for digging soil, sickles for cutting grain, and millstones for grinding flour. In some regions, people began to work with metals, including copper. Workers heated rocks and discovered melted copper inside them. They then experimented with making the copper into tools and weapons. These proved to be easier to make and use than those made of stone. Craftspeople in Western Asia discovered that mixing copper and tin formed bronze. This was a technological breakthrough because bronze was stronger than copper. Bronze became widely used between 3000 and 1200 BC. This period is known as the Bronze Age. Few people, however, could afford bronze and continued to use tools and weapons made of stone. Progress check. Explaining. How did the spread of agriculture affect trade? Thinking like a historian. Making inferences. In Çatalhöyük, the homes were built very close together. Each house had a door in its roof. People climbed into their homes using ladders. Use the internet to research why the people of Çatalhöyük used this style of building. Then make an inference about the reason for the roof doors and present it to the class. For more information about making inferences, read the chapter, What Does a Historian Do?
All right, let's go ahead and review what we learned in this particular part of the lesson. Now, we know that Neolithic people needed protection from wild animals, from the elements, such as the weather. So settling into communities provided them with that sense of security. And since they worked together, there was always a steady food supply. And so their populations were growing. Now, as populations grew, more people were available to work and to make food, gather things. So they began to start trading their supplies and their food with other communities for things that they wanted and didn't have, or things that they needed and didn't have. Now, because there was so much food being produced, they didn't need as many people out in the fields growing the food, so people began to specialize and do other tasks. So you had your artisans, you had your particularly skilled workers, you had people that made jewelry, people who specialized in making weapons. All of these things started to come about during this time period because not everybody needed to be involved in gathering enough food for their survival. So the roles continued to shift a little bit more. Now the men were working in the fields, they were herding the animals, they were protecting their tribes, and the women were raising the younger generation. They were taking care of the babies. They were managing the food supplies to make sure their families had enough food. They were making the clothing and things like any kind of weaving that needed to be done. That was the responsibility of the women. But when communities grew too fast in an area, they depleted or used up all of the resources in that area, and that led to that area being abandoned. So if you used up everything in an area and you don't have enough to survive anymore, you're going to move to a different area. So as the Neolithic Age comes to an end, they were making more and more advances, better tools, and one of the biggest discoveries was the discovery of bronze. So what they discovered that when they mix copper and tin together, they created a material that was stronger than both of those elements. They created bronze. So bronze was easier to work with. It was easier to make into tools. And so the shift over to using bronze became known as the Bronze Age. Now, bronze was also expensive, so not everybody used it. A lot of people still stuck with their weapons and things that were made out of stone for this reason.
Civilizations emerge. Guiding question: what characteristics did early civilizations share? Humans continued to develop more complex cultures, or ways of life. By the beginning of the Bronze Age, communities were widespread. More complex cultures, called civilizations, began to develop in these communities. 4 of the great river valley civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China, emerged around 3000 BC. All civilizations share similar characteristics. Cities and government. One characteristic of these early civilizations was that they developed cities and formed governments. The first civilizations developed in river valleys, where fertile land made it easy to grow crops and feed large numbers of people. The rivers provided fish and water. They also encouraged trade, which allowed the exchange of both goods and ideas. The cities that developed in these valleys became the centers of civilizations. People formed governments to protect themselves and their food supplies. In these early civilizations, the first governments were monarchies. A monarchy is a type of government led by a king or queen. Monarchs created armies to defend against enemies and made laws to keep order. They also appointed government officials who managed food supplies and building projects. Religions. Religions emerged in the new civilizations to help people explain their lives. For example, religions helped explain the forces of nature and the role of humans in the world. Early people believed that gods were responsible for a community's survival. Priests performed religious ceremonies to try to win the support of the gods. Rulers claimed that their own power was based on the approval of the gods.
Okay, so let's take a minute to briefly review what happened. So these early civilizations started to develop their own types of governments. So how to rule, what kind of laws were going to be in place, what was expected of people. And the 4 main river valley civilizations were Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China. And you can see them labeled here on the map. So here's Egypt, here's India, here's Mesopotamia, and here's China. Now, people formed governments to protect themselves and their food supplies. So these civilizations were monarchies at the time. And a monarchy is a government that's led by a king or a queen. They developed armies to help defend their areas, their people, their food supplies. And a lot of these different communities were very heavily influenced by the different religions in their area.
Social structure. Early civilizations had social class structures. That is, people in society were organized into groups. These groups were defined by the type of work people did and the amount of wealth or power they had. Generally, rulers and priests, government officials, and warriors made up the highest social class. They set the rules and made the important decisions. Below this class was a large group of free people, including farmers, artisans, and craftspeople. At the bottom of the class structure were enslaved people, most of whom were captured from enemies during war. Writing and art. To pass on information, people invented ways of writing. These early systems used symbols in place of letters and words. Writing became an important feature of these new civilizations. People used writing to keep accurate records and to preserve stories. Civilizations also created art for enjoyment and practical purposes. Artists created paintings and sculptures portraying gods and forces of nature. People designed massive buildings that served as places of worship or burial tombs for kings. Progress check. Speculating. Why did early peoples form governments?
All right, so let's go ahead and watch the short related video.
Traces of Paleolithic hunter-gatherer cultures dating back over 20,000 years are abundant all across Central Europe. By the year 3000 BCE, or before the Common Era, the Copper Age had arrived on the peninsula. What life was really like for these early inhabitants was revealed as recently as 1991 by an amazing discovery made on a glacier high in the Italian Alps. A couple on a hike found the mummified body of a man. Now known as the Iceman, his body was almost completely intact. Near him was his leather backpack that contained many important items used in his daily life, such as a flint knife and 2 other pieces of flint with which he could start fires. But his most important possession was an axe made of almost pure copper that proved to be very helpful in dating his life to about 5500 BCE. For hunting, he had a bow and a quiver of arrows. For clothing, he wore animal leathers and had leather boots lined with grass. Based on his muscles and facial features, scientists fleshed out his face to show how he would have appeared when he was alive. By the year 12,000 BCE, a culture known as the Etruscans had established themselves on the Italian peninsula. Scholars now believe they might be the first truly native Italian culture. By 800 BCE, the Etruscans had established many fortified city-states along the western coast of Italy in the modern-day region of Tuscany. They were highly skilled builders and metalworkers, and they greatly influenced the little village of Rome, which was under Etruscan rule for the first 250 years of its existence. Many things long attributed to the Romans actually come from the Etruscans, including road building, the use of the arch in construction, and gladiator fights, which began when slaves fought to the death at funerals as a sacrifice to honor the deceased. Established in 753 BCE, Rome grew from a tiny hilltop village overlooking the Tiber River into the capital of the greatest empire of ancient times. With innovative military techniques and a tenacious nature, the Romans proceeded to conquer neighbor after neighbor, and by 200 BCE had taken over the entire peninsula. By 29 BCE, when Augustus Caesar was proclaimed emperor, the Roman Empire was at its peak. To tie their empire together, the Romans built a system of roads that eventually totaled over 53,000 miles. The old saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was then quite true. Eventually, these same roads would allow invaders to march on the Roman Empire, resulting in its fall in 488 CE. Thus began what is known as the Dark Age. No longer did the people of the Italian peninsula think of themselves as Romans. Rome was literally gone. Without the Roman army to protect them, the towns and cities were forced to fend for themselves, and hiding behind their walls and fortifications, they soon became suspicious of all outsiders. No longer citizens of an empire, the people began to think of themselves as citizens of their cities. Thus, you had Florentines, citizens of Florence, Milanese, citizens of Milan, the Viennese hailed from Venice, and of course, the Neapolitans came from Naples.
All right, so this clip of the video gives you an idea of how groups of people changed over time, how they developed these governments, how they developed armies to protect themselves, how the different people in the different civilizations were able to branch out and do other things and specialize in different things, whether it was building roads or if they were different kinds, they built tools, or if they specialized in art. All of these things became possible as there were more and more people part of these different empires, part of these different groups, so that not everyone had to be focused anymore on gathering food for the community. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our review questions. Again, these are going to be the same ones that are in your book. These ones are going to be located on page 69. Number 1, what was systematic agriculture? Number 2, how did specialization affect the lives of Neolithic peoples? Number 3, what was the agricultural revolution? Number 4, how did farming lead to new types of economic activities? Number 5, what are the advantages and disadvantages when a community grows? Number 6, which groups made up the largest social classes in early civilizations? And number 7, you are the leader of a band of hunter-gatherers. You've seen other bands settle in river valleys and begin to farm. Write a speech to persuade your own band to settle and begin farming. Please make sure you use complete sentences when you answer your questions. If you have any other questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.